It's Friday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. After 5 weeks of this, the campaigns head into the final sprint of the election.
How are you doing?
Very good. Last few days after many weeks on the road.
With Labour still 20 points ahead in the polls, has the election campaign made any difference? Also today.
If you want higher taxes and higher welfare, that's what Keir Starmer will do. If you want lower taxes and lower welfare, that's what I will do. Do not surrender to our welfare system to the Labour Party and Keir Starmer.
How will the next government tackle a growing welfare bill?
Dealing with everything we have to do with,
A shaky performance by Joe Biden in the first presidential debate. How worried should US Democrats be?
But what about his performance? What about his performance tonight? Everyone's questioning his performance.
Well, how about the substance? Again, I mean...
But it's the performance everyone's talking about, Governor.
And what better place to be to chat to people about the election than the pub? We're at the Thorn Tree in Ossett in West Yorkshire to chat to a few people as they have some lunch.
Joining us today, Conservative peer and former Health Minister James Bethell, Labour's Bel Ribeiro-Addy, City AM's opinion and features editor Alice Denby, and Sienna Rogers from The House magazine. This is Politics Live Election 2024. Welcome. Yes, the final days of this election campaign. Let's show you the BBC election poll tracker, familiar to all you Politics Live viewers. And we're going to look at it because we want to see exactly, particularly, how the two main parties have fared. While we wait for that actually to appear, you will see when it comes up that Labour's lead over the Tories has been pretty well static, at least 20 points ahead. Let's show you it now. It's really for the duration of the election campaign. And you can see here, Labour and the Conservatives, the gap stays pretty well the same. They've both dropped a little bit. But my opening question on the basis of those figures is, James Bethell, how much has the campaign mattered?
I think it has mattered because of Nigel Farage. Him coming in has disturbed things quite a lot from that point of view. But has it moved any voters' opinions? Well, I've been on the doorstep quite a lot, and I haven't detected that a whole bunch.
You haven't? And is that a failure of the campaign, or you thought it was just a foregone conclusion in many people's minds from the start? I
think also people leave their decisions right till the last minute. They do on their holidays nowadays. They do on their voting as well. But also, listen, the problems we have as a country are intractable. They're huge. They're not easily boiled down to campaigning gobbets. And therefore, in this sort of campaign, 2017, 2019, those were campaigns that really did make a big difference. Here, it's a different circumstance, I think.
How much has the campaign mattered, Bel? When you look at those figures, James is right. In fact, the party that has increased quite a lot is Reform. Liberal Democrats a little bit. Greens have stayed pretty well static throughout. But that gap between Labour and the Tories has pretty well stayed the same.
I think it's made a massive difference, actually. I think people are even more resolute that they're sick of the Tories. You're absolutely right, James. Insurmountable problems in this country. That's after 14 years of Conservative Party leadership. I mean, I was down in Worthing, a seat that I've been campaigning in the lead up to the election, and I found a Tory councillor there that's switching his vote to Labour. I think what's also happening is, with all of the polls and all the messaging that Labour are going to win, some people are thinking that they don't need to come out and vote, or that they might vote for a smaller party in a bit of protest. But I have to tell people that the polls are not absolute, and if they want change, they're going to have to vote for it. If they want the party of government to change, they're going to have to vote Labour. Without
sort of talking about specific seats, how much have you found with voters on doorstep saying they will go for other parties because they feel they can, smaller parties?
I've heard it a bit. Most people are seeming to be voting Labour, but some people, as I said, because of what the polls are saying, think that they can get away potentially with this, and they have to be a bit more strategic, because you have to remember that in 2019 the Tories' votes didn't really go up. Labour's went down. And if Labour's don't go up this election, we could end up with Tories in many seats.
All right. What do you think in terms of the significance of the election campaign itself?
Yeah, I think you can hear from Bel that Labour's biggest worry is low turnout. They're worried that the way that the campaign has gone, that Labour's victory is a foregone conclusion, is actually going to damage their vote. I think the campaign matters in that respect because it's been so lacklustre that it's really not getting people out on the doors. I mean, to the extent that I've done any speaking to people, there are good local Tory MPs in some constituencies that do have a good reputation, and we may see some of those keep their seats. But yeah, I mean, in terms of, you can see the polls, it's done very little to change the overall outcome, which will be a Labour victory.
What do you think, Sienna? Has it mattered much, the significance of the election campaign itself, listening to both James and Belle, in terms of the problems being so big that perhaps the focus, broadly speaking, is that the Conservatives have gone for some retail policies and Labour have kept it very broad?
Yes, Labour have pursued this sort of safety-first approach to this campaign, and you can completely understand why they don't want to jeopardise that position in the polls. I mean, as you say, the gap between Labour and the Tories hasn't really changed. It's remained consistent. I think there has been shifts underneath that kind of disguised by that gap staying the same. So Labour has been leaking some of its votes to other parties, to independents, but in the meantime, it's actually been switching those 2019 Conservative voters to make up for it. So it looks as if there's been no change. There has been some change. But yeah, I think there is a decent point there in terms of the kind of what we've been talking about during this campaign. It doesn't seem like the big issues a lot of the time are actually being discussed.
I mean, is this normal for an election campaign in your experience? Because Belle is actually saying in 2019 the Tories did stay fairly static, but in fact it was Labour's vote that dropped dramatically.
No, in recent history, actually, we've had ding-dong elections with big issues being put out. I mean, 2017.
Well,
2017.
Yeah.
Theresa May tried to change. She tried to get a social mandate for changing welfare, and it blew up in her face. That has been a warning to everyone. We need to reboot several parts of our economy. We need to do a fix on housing, on health, and on tax. You need the voters' permission to do that, but it's not being discussed. So that is very worrying. And also the personalities have gone very bland now. Rishi's going to hope that his puckishness and enthusiasm and stamina is going to somehow come through. That hasn't really happened, and Keir has taken a safety-first approach. So this is without big policies and without big personalities.
The problem is in the lead-up to the election, particularly from the Conservative side, what we've been seeing is a lot of scapegoating. With the Rwanda bill, that became the big thing, scapegoating migrants all along to just distract away from the Tories' consistent failure. I think that's been a massive problem. We're not discussing the huge issues, we're not discussing the things that the Tories should have fixed in their 14 years of government because they're talking about other things to detract from the fact that they cannot deliver.
I'd put it a little bit more constructively, which is we have not, in the last few years, formed any consensus on some of those big issues. On immigration, which you mentioned, on housing, which I mentioned. We really need as a country to move on and to try and figure out big answers, but we're scrapping around on the detail and playing a blame game. And I agree, in my own area of health, that's really cost us a lot. There are reforms that should have happened but got lost in the weeds.
But in a way, Belle, the Rwanda scheme, the discussion about migrants, that was happening way before the election campaign too. That hasn't changed. For me, looking at the big policies on tax, for example, both parties have pretty well agreed. You know, no headline or no increases in headline taxes. Was that right?
Well, what's happening at the moment is we're seeing Rishi consistently lying about what Labour are going to do with tax. If we look at what Labour's policies have said, our tax is going to end up being about 0.2% of GDP, whereas what the Conservatives are proposing is going to be 0.6%. The reality is that if you're a working person, you're going to be better off under Labour, not the Tories. So consistently saying that,
Labour are going to cost £2,000 more.
Absolutely, that's just false.
Would you concede that there is some scepticism amongst the media, amongst politicians and amongst the voters, that it's going to be extremely tough for any future government to stick to those commitments?
It's going to be extremely tough for any future government after the Conservatives, regardless. It's going to be tough on every single level. It might have been better
to be transparent about that up front so that there isn't a big shock after the election, because that's how trust gets broken down.
They've been very clear about how much they're going to spend. Some people even think that we've been too cautious as a party about how much we're going to spend. And I do note that things may change over the years, but at the moment, your average family is not going to be paying more tax under the Labour Party. And for Rishi to continue pushing that is completely false.
Well, can I just say that Paul Johnson from the IFS says that both parties are essentially being dishonest in their manifestos. The idea that anyone has a fully costed plan for the future, it's just not accurate. So I think you are going to get into government and find out that you're going to have to make incredibly tough decisions, and we all know it's coming.
Right. Well, we've mentioned the smaller parties. Sorry, you wanted to say something?
I was just going to say, as James sort of mentioned earlier, the 2017 was the campaign where we saw things really change, and that Theresa May thing. Are we ready for grown-up conversations that are really difficult, where we talk about the cost of things?
Well, not if you want to win elections, is what the politicians would say. I mean, I don't know the answer to that, but that's certainly the conclusion that the mainstream parties seem to have come to.
Well, except that there is this populist trend on both the left and the right of leaders who make outrageous visual suggestions do actually capture the imagination. Isn't it weird how young people, very young, people in their teens and 20s, say that they like reform because I think they seem to be creative and honest, sort of, and it somehow captures their imagination. It's a really worrying trend. And I think an odd thing about this election is how undisruptive both Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak.
And it's been left perhaps to the other parties to do that. You don't agree?
I'm just saying, what evidence do you have that younger people are switching to reform? That's not what I'm hearing.
I'm not saying that this is going to change the election. I'm saying that there's a lot of anecdotal and polling evidence that young people have turned their backs on the traditional parties, which is unsurprising, and are interested in, unfortunately, the politics of populism, partly because I think it sounds adventurous and brave, because they necessarily...
Well, and interestingly, the EU elections seemed to point in a direction that showed some rejection for Green parties in Europe, and yes, evidence that young people, some of them, looking to parties on the right of the mainstream parties.
I think people are disillusioned with politics, and I understand why. Some of my colleagues in Parliament who think about a lot of the scandals that have gone by have done some very awful things, and it's really, really damaged the view of politics and politicians, and some people think that it's not going to make a difference. But absolutely, in this election, it is.
Right, let's just show you this from Keir Starmer. He was asked earlier today.
If you lose this election, particularly if you lose badly, will you resign as the leader of the Labour Party?
Yes.
OK, thank you. Well,
that was short and sweet. But what did you make of that? If he loses, he's quitting.
I think that's what most leaders should or would say. This is a very defining election in our nation's history, and obviously, if
Jeremy Corbyn stayed on for quite some time.
Well, that was completely different. That 2017 election, if you remember...
No, 2019 I'm talking about.
Oh, no, we had a leadership election almost immediately afterwards.
It wasn't immediate. Yeah, OK, a few months.
Our leadership elections take
maybe
quite a long time because we're a very democratic party.
Okay. That was why it took like 4 months to actually conclude that election.
Because we consult everybody before we do it. But after 2017, particularly... Actually, I remember those few weeks afterwards, until Theresa May did that deal with the DUP, nobody knew who was going to be in charge.
What did you make of it?
Well, I think the thought hadn't occurred to him for a moment. He was trying to get rid of the question because he didn't have a good answer. But well done for him for coping with the unexpected.
Well, absolutely. Anyway, there are more debates and interviews, of course, to watch in the final few days. The last of Nick Robinson's panorama interviews with party leaders in the election campaign is tonight with the Liberal Democrat leader, Ed Davey, at 7:30 on BBC One. Now, there'll also be the Question Time special featuring Nigel Farage from Reform UK and the co-leader of the Green Party, Adrian Ramsey. So make sure you watch all of those as we've been talking about the smaller parties. Now, let's talk about the welfare system. You heard in the headlines Rishi Sunak talking about the savings that the Conservatives are going to make if they win the election. Joining us for this discussion is the SNP's David Linden. Hello to you, David. I'm going to just start the discussion in the studio, but aware, of course, you're there and will be listening in order to contribute in just a moment. Now, we've been asking people to share their questions with us throughout the campaign, and Darren Partington in Lancashire has sent us this. With the cost of living and petrol, etc., why would the Conservatives want to cut £12 billion from the welfare state, which most will be taken from the disabled or people with disabilities? James Bethell.
Well, the total welfare bill is up £69 billion in, I think, 6 years, which is an astonishing amount of money. I am personally very concerned about the underlying health of the country. A lot of that increase has been from people dropping out of the workforce because they're too poorly to work, and we have to address that. But the idea that none of it has gone to people who haven't been properly assessed, I think is wrong. And certainly voters and taxpayers are very concerned that some of that money might not be going to the right people or prioritised to those in poverty who really need it. So I think having a review and thinking about how you get all that money into the right pockets is the right thing. And the assessment from the Prime Minister is that there are potential savings of 12 billion. They shouldn't come out of the pockets of the disabled or the severely poor. For sure, I agree with that. But the idea that all of that money is being well spent is about as credible as the idea that all the furlough money was well spent. It's just not reasonable, and having a second look at it is the right thing to do.
Would you just agree with that on principle, having a second look at it? Not cutting disability, says James Bethel?
I think it's really, really wrong to be looking at cutting welfare in the time of this cost of living crisis. You know, it's kicking people when they are down. Actually, you find that whilst there is certainly some benefit fraud that goes on, 9 times more is taken out of our economy by tax avoidance.
Is it
policies
fraud?
which the Tories have often supported?
Is it fraud, Bell, or are there people, as James Bethel has set out, who are getting benefits who shouldn't? Not because they're defrauding the system, but that they are potentially fit to work.
I'm only talking about where there are instances of irregularities. Right. I don't think that people generally go to claim benefits when they don't necessarily need them. We're in a situation where people are very, very hard up. As you said, people are sick. People are not getting to the NHS and getting their appointments when they need to. It's taking a lot of people out of work. And I don't think that we're in a situation now where we can kick these people when they are down, when they need it most. The welfare state is one of the best things about our country.
But the bill is going up, and you're happy for it to go up?
It has to go up where it needs to go up. And I believe that there are other ways in which we can find money. There are other things that we can do to put people back into work, making them healthy, for example.
Well, we'll come on to that. But you kicking people when they're down, as Bell says?
No, I don't want to do that. What I do want, though, is to get people back to a place where they can be working, providing for themselves and for their families, and to be restored to a place of health. I'm afraid quite a lot of people, when they take a knock, find it tricky to get back on their own feet. And we haven't done enough for a lot of those people, and they go down the wrong channel, and that channel is sometimes ending up on a sofa or in a state of mental health crisis, and we need to be doing more for those people. That sometimes means taking them off some kind of sickness benefit and putting them into a programme that gets them into the workplace, back on their feet, new skills, new mental health support.
David Linden, is there anything that you've just heard that you disagree with? Oh, sorry, hang on, David, just start again. The microphone wasn't just quite up. Try again.
Yeah, quite a lot of things there I disagree with. Of course, Lord Bethel, who sits in the House of Lords on £320 a day, tax-free for the rest of his life, doesn't have to deal with constituency casework, as I've done for the last 7 years. One of the things that we saw, for example, during the COVID pandemic was the 2 million people in the UK so cruelly overlooked when the £20 uplift to universal credit was put in place. I've sat in the Work and Pensions Select Committee for a number of years now, and we know, because the evidence is actually there, that there's a £975 disability premium that's in place for those who've got a disability, perhaps because they have to run expensive equipment at home, so have higher energy bills, they have to have their food delivered to them, they have higher transport costs.
So
the reality is, at this election, we have the Conservative Party aided and abetted, I'm afraid, by a Labour Party, a pro-Brexit Labour Party led by Sir Keir Starmer, who are kicking on some of the poorest and most vulnerable people in society. In 7 years of being a Member of Parliament, I can tell you that those that I represent aren't on universal credit or legacy benefits for the fun of it. They're on it because they need it. And the sooner that we move away from this ridiculous debate othering people and focus on the real perpetrators of crime within the system, that is tax avoiders, let's go after them, let's invest more in HMRC, and let's not try and pick on people who are ultimately incredibly vulnerable,
David,
which the Conservatives get a track record of doing.
Right, well, do you want to answer that? You're in cahoots with the Conservatives, according to David Linden.
I'm not in cahoots with the Conservatives.
On this issue?
David, if you would have listened, I said pretty much what you did say in terms of the fact that we need to make sure that those that need benefits are getting them, and actually that we could make more in terms of the economy on tax avoidance. Nine times more.
I guess my question would be, what is the difference between the Labour Party and the Conservative Party when it comes to social security policy? Because as far as I can see, there's no plans for reform of universal credit. I remember at one point when Labour said that they wanted to abolish that. The reality is that they're still having the same language when it comes to conditionality, when it comes to sanctions. And Liz Kendall, who I know is not in your wing of the Labour Party, is probably just a bit as right-wing as the Conservatives when it comes to DWP policy. This election has shown up the very little difference that exists between the Conservatives and Labour, because the Conservatives are chasing the votes of reform, Labour are chasing the votes of the Conservatives, all the while some of the most vulnerable people in our communities are being left behind in this discussion.
The Labour Party are not advocating scrapping any more benefits at the moment in this particular election. That I would definitely say. So I wouldn't say that we're on par with the Conservatives in that sense. Absolutely
you are when
not.
it comes to sanctions and conditionality, I'm afraid.
Well, I personally, with sanctions, I think sanctions end up doing more harm than good.
Right.
Yeah. Liz Kendall doesn't think that, though, and she's going to be the next Secretary of State, and that's the concern for many people here in Glasgow East.
Right. I just want to ask a question. On the Labour Party in the manifesto, it says it contains no concrete policies on working age benefits. It does say there'd be a review of universal credit, so it makes work pay and tackles poverty. In principle, is there anything wrong with universal credit, having one benefit that covers most others, instead of it being fractured the way it used to be?
I think there are a number of different issues that that have arisen with universal credit, and one of them has actually been the way in which they impose sanctions. I understand why they decided to use it as a cover-all. I don't think it's always worked in certain senses, particularly when it comes to disability, but one of the major issues we're having at the moment is the way in which sanctions are imposed and how those end up affecting people.
James?
Listen, the sanctions regime is tricky. I mean, I have some sympathy for what Belle's saying. I don't think the answer is to dish out loads of sanctions because people are trying to cheat it. But 800,000 people have left the workforce and are now taking benefits. Could some of them be back in the workforce soon? Yes, I think they could be. And to the previous point, could then more money be focused on the disabled who do have genuine costs? Then yes, then I wish it was.
Right, and just briefly then on this fit note culture or fit note reform, because this is about issuing people with sick notes if they're unable to work. Now, in the manifesto, it says currently 94% of fit notes are being signed off as not fit for work. We, the Conservatives, in your manifesto, will design a new system which moves the responsibility for issuing fit notes away from our hard-pressed GPs towards specialist work and health professionals. Do you support that?
100%. Listen, it's just not working. Our poor GPs don't have the tools in the toolkit to help someone who's dropped out of work. It needs to be given to someone who can provide mental health support, new skills, a whole portfolio of assistance, and we're failing the people by not doing that.
Absolutely not. I don't agree with that.
You don't?
Because it sounds like the same type of people that were put in place to put forward to do the PIP assessments.
This is
They've been absolutely
personal independence
They're talking
payment.
at the same time about taking PIP assessments and reforming that to give it to GPs and to medical professionals. So it's like the opposite policy for PIP assessments. It doesn't make any sense.
Right, but Labour isn't committing then to bringing down the welfare bill at all, which it says when it comes to, let's take disability benefit payments, they'll rise to £58 billion in 28-29, which they may need to do. There is no commitment, is there, to bring down the welfare bill in any part of it?
No, I mean, they've talked about what you've already mentioned and talk about reforming work capability assessments. But as you say, they haven't talked about bringing down that bill. But I think we're talking about the stick here when also we have to talk about the carrot, right? I mean, the thing is, why is this country so unhealthy? Because of such long NHS waiting lists, because of the kind of slow recovery of public services from the pandemic. All of these kind of things is actually it's probably more important than the way in which we reform the benefit system.
And isn't that true?
Well, that is absolutely correct. I mean, I did a sort of Control F on the Labour manifesto, and it mentions the word welfare twice, both in relation to animal welfare. This is despite the fact that the OBR says that the rise in people being out of work because of long-term sickness is the biggest threat to our long-term financial stability. You know, we're on course just to keep flat, just to keep spending what we're spending, to be at nearly to have the debt to GDP ratio being at nearly 300% in the next 50 years. The City is already warning that if Labour comes in and borrows more than expected, the bond markets are going to react incredibly aggressively, and it's going to be Liz Truss all over again. You have to find savings somewhere.
I believe that's because we're looking at the root of the problem. We're looking at a new deal for working people. We're looking at investing more in the NHS. All of these things would help people get...
But all you're talking about is making it harder to employ people by putting way more rights on employers. Whereas the Conservatives are at least talking about this problem of long-term of people being out of work.
More rights. I think it allows them to stay in a safe and secure work environment where they're paid well, where they're treated well, and where they're more likely to stay.
What are you going to do about the millions of people who are out of work? The rise that we've seen since the pandemic in people being signed off work because of mental health problems. Many of these people are young men, and if you leave them on welfare, you're condemning them to a life of despair.
Investing in our mental health services.
But with what, Belle? There's been no commitment in the manifesto to put significant amounts of funding into this.
I think what we have to look at is this whole idea of, oh, we can't spend here, we can't spend. A lot of the time, too many people want to talk about our economy as if it's a household bill. And people are worried about things such as borrowing, etc. We have to invest.
Well, should Labour then be increasing borrowing?
I think if we need to, we should.
Right.
I think we should. And
there's an honest answer.
What I would say is that when you invest in public services, there is a return. There is a return. So at the end of the day, if we are investing more in our public services, we are going to see a return, and we're going to see a healthier economy, definitely a healthier one than we've seen under the last 14 years.
Liz Truss was brought down because of unfunded borrowing.
Liz Truss.
But they were unfunded tax cuts.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, that is a completely different ballgame.
Well,
we do not have policies like
listening
Liz
to Belle, that is an honest assessment of, yes, if you want to invest in people, get them out of a sort of sick note culture, if it exists, by investing and by borrowing.
Yeah, that was a piece of honesty. I wish it was in the manifesto. I wish what we had in the manifesto were commitments spelt out about how we're going to make this country healthier, how we're going to get these 800,000 people back into work, how we're going to avoid going bust because of the sheer size of our welfare bills. And that's where we're heading at the moment.
Let me stress some of that, to be quite
Well, let me bring in David Linden, because it's a good point to come back to you, David, on the issue of raising taxes, as you have done in Scotland, to invest in public services. Why don't you do that with welfare? Why don't you raise taxes, or would you like to raise taxes more and use that money to extend the sort of scheme you have to tackle child poverty, for example?
Well, one of the things I'd like to do, for example, is to ensure that something like 85% of welfare spending is not reserved to the United Kingdom Parliament. You're absolutely right to touch on the fact.
Yeah. You've done well on the child poverty, haven't you? You made a specific payment, you decided to do that, increase taxes more.
Yeah, and it comes into that fundamental point that if you want to have good public services, you've got to pay for it. And that means folk like myself, who are members of Parliament on good salaries, paying a little bit more in tax. And it comes back to the fundamental point that is not being discussed in this election campaign. You know, the Institute for Fiscal Studies have said that there is a conspiracy of silence between Labour and the Conservatives when it comes to tax and spends. The other issue, of course, is that Andy Haldane, the former chief economist of the Bank of England, says that you could not get a lettuce leaf between Labour and the Conservatives.
Sure, but I'm
the
asking
reality is, if you want to have good
sure.
public services, as we've done in Scotland,
yes.
with, for example, the Scottish Child Payment, that is lifting 90 to 100,000 children
why don't you extend
out of poverty.
Have you thought about extending it? Would you raise taxes more?
Well, one of the things we're doing at the moment is trying to deal with the almost certainly very tight fiscal position that we'll inherit as a result of an incoming Labour government.
You have those levers available to you. You do it when you want to.
And we have done
that.
Do
you want to do it enough on this?
And that's why, for example, in Scotland, as a result of our taxation rates, we have that free university education, the free under-22 bus passes.
And that's perhaps because it's a very generous settlement that you get from the Westminster government that you've been able to do those things.
I'm not necessarily sure that our health service would feel that, given that we spend something like upwards of £500 million
you're in charge of the health
mitigating
service,
Westminster austerity. Yes, we are in charge of, and that's why we've got the lowest A&E waiting times in the UK. But if you just let me finish for a moment, Jo, one of the issues we've got, and I see this as the SNP's social justice spokesperson, is that, for example, in Scotland, we don't have a bedroom tax. That's because the SNP Scottish Government spends hundreds of millions of pounds investing in discretionary housing payments to mitigate Westminster austerity. Now, there's going to be war Westminster austerity from Sir Keir Starmer when he comes into government, and that's why the SNP will always stand up for Scotland. We'll always put Scotland's interest first, and the only way that people can get that is if they vote SNP on the 4th of July.
Is there an election coming along in a few days' time? David Linden, thank you very much there. Now, it was the first head-to-head debate of the US presidential election between a current president and a former president. But rather than a vision for the future, the battle lines seem to be drawn over their respective records and their fitness for office. It was at points often bad-tempered and at other points surreal. They also tackled all the issues that you'd expect, including immigration. Let's get a flavour.
We are living right now in a rat's nest. They're killing our people in New York, in California, in every state in the union.
I'm going to continue to move until we get the total ban on the total initiative relative to what we're going to do with more Border Patrol and more asylum officers.
President Trump?
I really don't know what he said at the end of that sentence. I don't think he knows what he said either. I will have that war settled between Putin and Zelensky as president-elect before I take office on January 20th. I'm in very good health. I just won 2 club championships, not even senior, 2 regular club championships. To do that, you have to be quite smart, and you have to be able to hit the ball a long way. And I do it. He doesn't do it. He can't hit a ball 50 yards.
I'm happy to play golf if you carry your own bag. Think you can do it?
That's the biggest lie that he's a 6 handicap of all.
I was an 8 handicap.
Yeah.
8
Never.
But I have, you know,
I've seen you swing. I know you swing.
Well, that was a bizarre clash over golf between the two men who would like to be president from November. Let's talk to the host of 538 Politics podcast in New York, Galen Druke. It's been a while, Galen. Welcome back to Politics Live. Your thoughts after watching last night?
Yeah, Joe, great to be with you. After last night, honestly, the conversation in the U.S. has turned to, will Democrats try to replace Joe Biden on the ticket? I mean, to quote the headline from the insider sort of politics rag Politico, it's Dems wake up to a nightmare. I mean, we've already seen in, left-leaning publications, multiple op-eds calling for Joe Biden to step aside, 2 in the New York Times, in the Atlantic, in the New Republic. And I think it's a reaction to the performance that folks saw last night. I mean, 15 minutes into the debate, we didn't see it there, but Joe Biden said something along the lines of, at the end of his comment, "We beat Medicare," which was just nonsensical. And it was, as the Vice President Kamala Harris has said, a slow start. But in reality, that's when the impression of the debate performance gets made.
Yes.
And going into the night, we knew that both of these candidates had sincere vulnerabilities. Folks who don't see either of them fit for president, when you ask them in polls, they don't see Biden fit because they say he is incompetent and too old. And for Trump, it's because they say he's dangerous and corrupt. And the reality is that last night's debate focused almost entirely on Joe Biden's vulnerabilities.
Now, in terms of Joe Biden and the sort of panic that you've described there amongst Democrats, ahead of the Democratic National Convention, is there any mechanism to change the candidate in terms of Joe Biden representing the Democrat Party? There isn't, is there?
The only real mechanism is Joe Biden stepping aside. So there has already been a primary process. Joe Biden has won almost all of the delegates. At this point, he would have to step aside and there would be something of an open convention. And I know folks will oftentimes shame the media for engaging in West Wing fan fiction because these scenarios seem so outlandish. But to give you some sense, we're waiting for the polls. And I think ultimately, in some ways, what happens next will be a reaction to how voters react to what they saw. Do we see Democrats moving from supporting Biden to maybe undecided in the polls in a way that would cause enough concern that Democrats come to the conclusion that, one way or another, Joe Biden is not going to be president from 2025 onwards. So I think that is the first step. And if you pay any attention to betting markets, which you can certainly get burned by them, but within the first 15 minutes or so of the debate, the odds that Joe Biden would be the Democratic nominee, which is to say the position for which he already has all of the delegates, dropped by 20 percentage points, according to the online betting markets. So, early indications there.
Yeah. All right. Galen, stay with us. Just your thoughts from what you saw of the debate.
It was concerning, I would say that. However, Joe Biden could have said absolutely nothing and he would still be better than having Trump as president of the United States.
I don't agree. It's such an important role. The decisions on the table in the Oval Office are so important. You need someone who's fully capable. And Joe Biden clearly
Do you believe that
is
Trump's
struggling.
that person?
I believe that the man I saw in Joe Biden is at a point of his life where he is not capable of major office.
Right, but a man who's a convicted felon might be.
Well, he was at least in charge of his faculties, and it's up to the American voters to make that decision.
Right.
But Biden shouldn't be on the ticket.
So then how would a Labour government with Keir Starmer deal with the Trump presidency if it happens?
I have absolutely no idea. I think that kind of question is above my pay grade. But I do know that people in this country are not fans of Trump. You could see that from when he visited, when he was president. And as I said, Biden could have said absolutely nothing and he still would have been a better choice than Trump?
I mean, I found this debate incredibly painful to watch, and I just think it's a real insult both to American voters and to the entire West that neither party, neither the Democrats or the Republicans, could find better candidates to put on the stump. And frankly, you know, we had that rather self-satisfied man in the audience at one of our leadership debates saying to Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer, "Are you the best we've got?" I mean, frankly, America should be so lucky.
Well, maybe after that debate, he might change his mind, that person who asked the question. Sienna?
Yeah, I mean, I agree that it is completely insulting. It's something that should have been sorted out quite a while ago. It's been clear for a long time now that this problem with Joe Biden, and it's really concerning that the Democratic Party haven't sorted it out. I think that's because, according to polling, other alternatives to Biden actually don't poll as well against Trump. But at this point, it looks like Trump is on course for a win, especially after a debate like that. And it's actually just an insult to voters not to replace him. So they have to do that. In terms of Keir Starmer's relationship, I do think comparing what's going to happen in the coming months to 1997, where Tony Blair, newly elected, then had a visit from Bill Clinton. They gelled really well. He was getting on with Northern Ireland. He had such a mission in terms of foreign policy. And this time it's going to be really, really hard. There could be
on the issue of Ukraine and Russia.
The Trump presidency, possibly. There's France, where the far right are doing really well. It's going to be a real challenge for Keir Starmer. Not much of an opportunity there in the way that it was for Blair coming in.
In terms of foreign affairs, certainly. Galen, just before we let you go, one of the issues for the Democrats is there's no obvious alternative, is there, to Joe Biden? I mean, who would it be? Who could it be?
You're absolutely right. And I think one of the challenges here is that when you look at the polling, Kamala Harris, the vice president, has not done much better than Joe Biden in head-to-head polling against Donald Trump, if better at all. And then you sort of open the field up if you say it's not going to be Kamala Harris, which, of course, would also be a big move to make, which would be move beyond the current vice president to somebody else. You know, going back to the betting markets, maybe you see people suggesting the governor of California, Gavin Newsom. He's certainly been sort of auditioning for the job for the past year. But I think, you know, we're at a moment where in 2020, when you asked Democrats, you know, what's the most important thing for you in this primary, choosing somebody to run against Donald Trump, it was electability, whether or not Joe Biden or whether or not the nominee can beat Donald Trump. And at that moment in time, it was Joe Biden. But he's potentially nearing a situation where he will have made successive decisions that will put the country in a position to be looking at reelecting Donald Trump. And so his entire reason for being as a politician is now called, as a president, is now called into question by the circumstances of last night.
Galen Druke from 538 Politics podcast in New York. Thank you very much, and catch up on some much-needed sleep, I should think. Let's return to politics here because BBC's news reporter Jim Connolly has been out and about in Ossett in West Yorkshire.
Hi, Joe. Welcome along to the Thorn Tree in Ossett. Friday afternoon in the pub. Must have drawn the short straw somewhere. But aside from coming along because it's the pub and it's Friday afternoon, we thought it's a great place to come and chat about politics. And to give you an idea about how Wakefield breaks down politically, it's an interesting kind of place. It's traditionally been a very Labour town, but then at the last election, the Conservatives won, and Brexit played a big part of that. That was a big Brexit voting area, and that meant a big shift to the Conservatives, although recently we saw a shift back to Labour at a recent by-election. So, an interesting place to get a flavour of what's going on across the country. And, Kat, you've had us down here. Tell us, is politics the talk of the pub?
It's certainly a topic in a pub, definitely. With pubs being the community hub that they are, then obviously people do talk lots about what's going on, especially at the minute, because it's very prominent in the news.
I know you don't want to get into your own personal politics because you don't want to sort of alienate one side or the other of your customer base, but is there anything you want politicians to be talking about as a landlady?
Yeah, I think pubs should be a safe space for everybody. But yeah, I think that we would like, certainly as a member of the BPPA, the Long Live the Local campaign, I think we would like the local government and the government indeed to look at you know, the contribution that pubs and community hubs like ours make to society, socially and economically.
Do you think that sometimes gets forgotten?
I think that it can be overlooked. You know, we are a vital part of our community. People use the pub for happy occasions, sad occasions. You get all different members of your community coming to the pub for lots of different reasons. So yeah, I do think that, you know, sometimes pubs can get overlooked for the value of what we provide.
Am I right to grab a couple of customers?
Absolutely, go right ahead.
Right. Guys, can I just quickly interrupt? Tell us, are you excited about the election?
Absolutely, yes.
And what are the issues you want politicians to be talking about at this next election?
Well, I've noticed that they're overlooking all the young people who are getting murdered. Knife crime. It's horrendous in this country. And nobody seems to have done anything or said anything about it. But if it was one of their own children, I wonder if it'd be a topic. Because I've suffered grief. I lost my only son. And I know exactly what it's like to be grieved of an only child or any child. So I would love them to get a grip with the country, because that's our future. The young people are our future.
A lot of the parties have promised more police on the streets. A lot of them have talked about tackling antisocial behaviour. Does that strike at all with you?
It doesn't do any good whatsoever. They need to have proper police, and they need police that are honest and straightforward and are searching these young people who are out, who haven't got proper parents, and allowing them out at night because they shouldn't be out. And then next thing you know, they've stabbed somebody. What are they doing there? What is this world about? This is our future, and it's the future of our country. These are the boys and men that's grown up in this country today, and it is the future of our country.
Some strong views there. Politically, are you as passionate as her?
Unfortunately not, no. I have no passion. I don't know what's going on with the parties. I don't know the policies. I don't think they're in touch with what they need to be doing. They just tell you what they want you to hear and hope that you vote for them. So,
what would you like a politician to talk about? You work at a local garage down the road. Is there anything they talk about when it comes to your business?
The problem is, I don't think none of the politicians are in touch with the average human being. You know, they're in their own little circle, doing their own little things, and they're telling us what we want to hear. But I don't think they know the real issues and the real things that need sorting. Like Kitty says, they'll do nothing about the knife crime. They'll say they'll put police on the streets, but the police will be there just doing what they're told, meeting quotas, not actually out there enforcing anything and stopping anything. So it'll just keep going, and we'll just keep going till the next election, until we have to vote for someone else. And we don't know their policies either, and they probably keep half of the promises that they've said they will.
Jo, it is that level of frustration and I suppose apathy that we heard there that we keep hearing up and down the country when we stop in and speak to people. It's worth thinking, though, that this is just a bit of a reflection, a snapshot of a few views here in Ossett. That doesn't reflect the whole country, but interesting though it is. And if you want to know a full list of who's standing in this area, head to the BBC News website.
Jim, thank you very much. And here are the candidates in Ossett and Denbigh Dale. You can see there on the screen. Two very contrasting views there from two voting members of the public. Apathy, though, does seem to be a fairly strong sort of thread throughout the campaign.
I found that I would knock on 9 doors and get apathy, and on the 10th you get someone who felt strongly. So oddly, that was rather representative of my experience. I've been to America and France recently. There, politics is really bitter. I'd take that kind of politics over that any day of the week.
Well,
I would say even in the apathy, you can hear a strong sense of people realising that things are wrong in this country. And I would say to anyone, if you think that for the past 14 years things have been awful and your life hasn't been better, we need change and you have to vote for it. Vote Labour.
Thank you. Thank you to all of our guests for joining me today. I will be back on Monday with more Politics Live at 12:15 here on BBC Two in the iPlayer. Only a few days to go.